The respiratory system, created by Alyssa, Locke, Tabitha, Switzon, Blair, Kierra, Taylor, and Peyton, Pressley. Partial pressure is the pressure exerted by a particular gas in a mixture of gases. A gas will diffuse from an area of high partial pressure to an area of lower partial pressure. Hence, higher the partial pressure of a gas in one part of the system as compared to the other part of the system, faster the gas is exchanged to equalize the gas partial pressure in both parts of the system. The gas will diffuse down pressure gradients in the lungs and other organs as a result of differences in that partial pressure. The source of oxygen, called the respiratory medium, is air for the terrestrial animals and water for aquatic animals. Air is much less dense and less viscous, so it is easier to move into force through small passageways. Gas-tinged water is much more demanding. The amount of oxygen dissolved in a given volume of water varies, but is always less than equivalent to the volume of air. The warmer or saltier the water is, the less dissolved oxygen it can hold. Water has a lower oxygen content, greater density, and greater viscosity. The part of the animal where the oxygen from the environment diffuses into living cells and carbon dioxide diffuses out is the respiratory surface. All living cells must be bathed in water to maintain their plasma membranes. Therefore, the respiratory surface of all animals are moist, and the oxygen and carbon dioxide must first dissolve in water before crossing the membrane. Gas exchange occurs over the entire surface of unicellular organisms. In many animals, the bulk of the body does not have access to the respiratory medium, and the respiratory surface is a thin layer of epithelial cells separating the respiratory medium from blood or capillaries. For animals whose external surfaces does not provide enough area for proper gas exchange, will have a region in the body that is extremely folded or branched, thereby enlarging the area of the respiratory surface for gas exchange. Common respiratory surfaces include the outer surface, skin, gills, trachea, and lungs of organisms. The respiratory system is a major key to gas exchange in the body. Gas exchange occurs at two sites in the body: in the lungs, where oxygen is picked up and carbon dioxide is released at the respiratory membrane, and at the tissues, where oxygen is released and carbon dioxide is picked up. Lungs are localized respiratory organs, typically subdivided into many pockets. Lungs are located in one location and is connected to other parts of the body by the circulatory system. Lungs have a dense net of capillaries just under the epithelium, which serves as a respiratory surface. Lungs have evolved in spiders, land snails, and vertebrates. Even amphibians have small lungs that do not provide a large surface area, so they rely heavily on the diffusion of gases across other body surfaces. The size and complexity of lungs correlate with the animal's metabolic rate. The mammalian respiratory system includes the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, branches into two bronchi, and the epithelium alveoli. This is a diagram of the respiratory system. Air will enter through the nostrils and is filtered by hairs, warmed, humidified, and sampled for odors as it flows through the nasal cavity. The pharynx directs air to the lungs and food into the stomach. Swallowing tips the epiglottis over the glottis and the pharynx to prevent food from entering the trachea. Alveoli are air sacs clustered at the tips of the tiny bronchi. Oxygen in the air enters the alveoli, dissolves in the moist films lining their inner surfaces, and rapidly diffuses across the epithelium into a web of capillaries that surround each alveoli. Net diffusion of CO2 occurs in the opposite direction from the capillaries, across the epithelium of the alveoli and into the airspace.
Okay, so there's 6 main parts of the respiratory tract. First, there's the pharynx. Then it goes into the larynx, then the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and then last the alveoli. First up, the pharynx. It consists of the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. And this connects the nasal cavity to the larynx. You can see on the left side of the picture the labeling of the 3 main parts of it, and then also where at the top where it connects the nasal cavity all the way down towards the bottom of the diagram into the larynx. And for the larynx, that's known as your voice box. It's where air passes through to create sounds which help you talk, and this consists of the supraglottis, also known as the epiglottis, the glottis, and then also the subglottis. which you can see labeled in the diagram. And then we're going to move on into the trachea, also known as the windpipe. This is lined with cilia and mucus to transport particles up towards the pharynx. And this is what cleans the respiratory system by allowing the particles to be swallowed through the esophagus. And then from the trachea, we go into the bronchi. This is the air passageway from the trachea into the lungs. There's 2 bronchi, one for each lung. From the bronchi, we go into the bronchioles, which are the smaller airways branching from the bronchi into the lungs, kind of like tree branches, and there are around 30,000 of them in each lung. And then last is the alveoli. These are the air sacs at the tip of the bronchioles that allow for gas exchange. When inhaling, oxygen is diffused from the moist film of the epithelium and then into the capillaries. When exhaling, carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillaries across the epithelium and then into the surrounding airspace. Unlike other parts of the respiratory tract, such as the air passageways, alveoli lack cilia and are therefore more susceptible to disease. To counteract this susceptibility, the alveoli are covered in surfactants, and when one doesn't have the surfactant, you're much more likely to suffer from respiratory distress, and then treated with artificial surfactants. And then for breathing is the ventilation of the lungs, and then the repeated exhalation and inhalation of air. Mammals use negative pressure breathing. So on inhalation, the expansion of the rib cage and the contraction of the diaphragm expand the chest cavity, which causes a decrease in the pressure and the expansion of the lungs to fill the space. The volume of the lungs increase as the rib muscles and diaphragm contract, and then the tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled in each breath.
The 2 pictures shown shows the process of negative pressure breathing. The picture on the left shows inhalation, which is when the diaphragm contracts and moves down. The rib cage expands as the rib muscles contract. The picture on the right shows the process of exhalation, which is when you breathe out and the diaphragm relaxes or moves up. Opposite of inhalation, the rib cage gets smaller as the rib muscles relax. As previously explained, tidal volume is the volume of air inhaled and exhaled with each breath. The tidal volume during maximal inhalation and exhalation is the vital capacity. The vital capacity in college-aged women is 3.4 liters, while in men is 4.8. After exhalation, a residual volume of air remains in the lungs. This can also be described as the air that remains after a forced exhalation. When humans age, the lungs lose their resilience or toughness, and residual volume will increase. Most of the time, your breathing is regulated by involuntary mechanisms that ensure gas exchange is coordinated with blood circulation and metabolic demand. The neurons mainly responsible for regulating breath are in the medulla. Sensors in the medulla, along with blood vessels, detect the blood carbon dioxide pH change in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord. For example, when the pH is lowered, the medulla's control circuits increase depth and rate of breathing. Both remain high until the excess CO2 is exhaled and the pH returns to normal. The pons, which is the part of the brain next to the medulla, regulates the tempo. Although the blood oxygen level rarely has an effect on the breathing control centers, whenever the oxygen does drop very low, oxygen sensors in the aorta and carotid arteries send signals to the breathing control centers, which then respond by increasing the breathing rate. These sensors exert secondary control over breathing. The figure shown explains the control of breathing in humans. The normal blood pH is shown to be 7.4. When carbon dioxide levels in the tissues begin to rise, the blood pH drops. This could happen when you exercise. The medulla then detects the decrease in pH of cerebrospinal fluid. The sensors in the major blood vessels also detect a decrease in pH. The medulla then receives the signals from the vessels and sends signals to the rib muscles, and the diaphragm increases the rate and depth of ventilation. The blood carbon dioxide levels fall and the pH rises back to normal. The metabolic demands of many organisms require that the blood transport large quantities of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The blood molecules called respiratory pigments facilitate this exchange through their interaction with oxygen and carbon dioxide. The partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood vary as the gases move between blood, air, and other body tissues. Blood arriving in the lungs has a low partial pressure of oxygen and a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide relative to air in the alveoli. In the alveoli, oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses into the air. By the time the blood leaves the lungs and the pulmonary veins, the partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide match the values for those gases in the alveoli. In tissue capillaries, gradients of partial pressure favor the net diffusion of oxygen out of the blood and carbon dioxide into the blood.
This shows us how oxygen and carbon dioxide gas exchange occurs in our body in 8 steps. First, we inhale oxygen, then it goes through our alveolar spaces, down into our pulmonary veins through our heart, out into our systemic arteries, and down into the body tissues, which contain systemic capillaries, which is where primary gas exchange occurs, and oxygen converts into carbon dioxide. Then the carbon dioxide is transported through our systemic veins back into our heart, out through our pulmonary arteries, and then out of our bodies. This diagram shows the relationship between the pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide at different points in the circulatory system, as numbered previously in this diagram here. So basically it's saying that at the first point, or at the first step in the process, when we inhale oxygen, the oxygen pressure is higher than it would be in step 5, which would be in the body tissues, or when that first primary gas exchange occurs. And as you can tell, that carbon dioxide intake is significantly lower than it is for oxygen. Respiratory pigments are proteins that transport oxygen and greatly increase the amount of oxygen that blood can carry. Another way of saying that is it is a molecule that increases how much oxygen the blood can carry. One of the key molecules that does this is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a red protein that is responsible for transporting oxygen in the blood of vertebrates. It can carry 4 molecules of oxygen, 1 molecule for each iron-containing heme group. If you don't know what a heme group is, you're about to find out. Hemoglobin contains iron, heme, which gives hemoglobin the ability to bind to oxygen. It also contains oxygen molecules and polypeptide chains as well. These two diagrams show the difference between an equilibrium pressure of oxygen and hemoglobin dissociation at a pH level of 7.4 and the same thing at a pH level of 7.2. The pH level of 7.2 shows that hemoglobin retains less oxygen when it has a lower pH, which means there's more carbon dioxide concentration in this diagram than there is in this diagram. Carbon dioxide transport. Hemoglobin also helps transport carbon dioxide and assists in buffering the blood. According to academic.oup.com, carbon dioxide is transported in the blood from the tissue to the lungs in 3 ways. 1, it is dissolved in solution. 2, it is buffered with water and carbonic acid. 3, it is bound to proteins, particularly hemoglobin. Approximately 75% of carbon dioxide is transported in the red blood cell and 25% in the plasma. Carbon dioxide from respiring cells diffuses into the blood and is transported either in blood plasma bound to hemoglobin or as bicarbonate ions, or HCO3.
Hello, my name is Switzon Blair, and this is my video on the transfer from the oxygen from the blood cells to the cells in the tissue, and the transfer of carbon dioxide from the tissue to the red blood cells to the alveolar sac out of the body. All right, so these red apples represent red blood cells. The delicious looking Fruit Loops represent the oxygens, the 4 oxygens that the hemoglobin helps the red blood cells contain. All right, just ignore that. And what basically happens is this is the red blood stream. This is basically plasma. So as the red blood cells go through the stream and they pass the cell tissues, the cell signals that it needs oxygen. The red blood cells give the oxygen to the tissue. The tissue then releases carbon dioxide. It diffuses into the bloodstream. When it diffuses into the bloodstream, it can either be diffused into the plasma or it can form a bicarbonate ions. It become a carbonic acid. Ta-da! So this green pair, which is not really a green pair, but a red blood cell that has accepted the carbon dioxide and released its oxygen molecule to the tissues. This green fruit right here, grape, represents the carbon dioxide that it collected from the cell's tissue, from this tissue cell right here, not vegetables, but a cell's tissue. So this would represent the carbonic acid, or it could also be bound to hemoglobin. When it's bound to hemoglobin, or it becomes when it is bound to hemoglobin, or becomes a bicarbonate carbonic acid, is transferred. Transferred. Once the red blood cells come here, this long tube right here is the alveolar sac, little sacs right here. These are the bronchioles. And these are the small, can't really see alveolar sacs. So when the red blood cell comes, it releases it. Don't want it no more. Whoosh. Then the cycle repeats. Whoosh. Red blood cell takes in oxygen, moves on, come back over here, repeats the process all over again, and then it continues.